Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Hannah Holling, Aga Valocha, and Josephine Ellis for organizing this panel discussion. My name is Hannah Mandel, and I am the archivist at the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College in Annandale-on-Hudson, New York. CCS Bard is a hybrid institution encompassing a 2-year master's program in curatorial studies, the Hessel Museum of Art, an exhibiting museum of contemporary art with a permanent collection, a library of over 40,000 volumes related to curatorial practice and art since 1960, and our archives. Our archives house 40 collections, including curators' papers, galleries' papers, papers of artists and art collectives, and our institutional records for the graduate program and museum. Today, I will be discussing the archives of curator John Hanhardt and how the creation of an archival finding aid, while limited by the conventions of archival cataloging, can be activated through interventions by the processing archivist. I suggest that the status quo of so-called neutral archival description that aims to present the archivist as an immovable authority does not fully contribute to creative activations of archival material, and descriptions of collections can be served by relying more openly and unambiguously on archivist intervention. In 2013, the CCS Archives acquired the archives of John G. Hanhardt, a seminal figure in the history of media art. John Hanhardt was the curator of film and video at the Whitney Museum of American Art from 1974 to 1996, curator of film and video at the Guggenheim Museum from 1996 to 2006, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum and Namjoon Pike Media Arts Center from 2006 to 2015. The Hanhardt archives are a large collection, roughly 125 linear feet, or 300 full-size archival boxes, as well as a significant portion of oversized material. Because of the scale of the archive and our limited staff at CCS, there is one archivist, me, a director of library and archives, and a full-time librarian, and we solicit part-time processing help from student employees, as well as the organizational structure of the papers upon our acquisition. That is very little, an almost flat structure. The processing of the Hanhardt papers has been ongoing for 11 years. Over his 50-plus year career, Hanhardt curated hundreds of exhibitions, wrote extensively on the development of video and media art, and taught and lectured at an extraordinary number of institutions. While Hanhardt is widely associated with his early and continued support and exhibition of Namjoon Pike, the curator maintained long-term relationships with many artists. Spread throughout this collection is a half-century of collected correspondence, ephemera, multiples, and artworks created by a staggering number of artists, documenting both relationships fostered by Hanhardt as well as what I like to refer to as incidental archives, that is, troves of material documenting artistic practice that in many cases were not solicited or necessarily reciprocated by Hanhardt. This includes unopened mail, unanswered queries, automated mailings sent by mailing lists that the curator might not have even knowingly subscribed to. While traditional archival methodology asks us to respect the original order of the collection, it was clear to me and my supervisor that these caches of material had high research value, and therefore we undertook the immense effort of identifying and isolating material directly related to nearly 1,000 different artists and 800 separate art and film venues, including museums, galleries, publications, and institutions. As I mentioned, it has been my ultimate responsibility to create an archival finding aid for the Hanhardt papers. An archival finding aid is a document that consists of descriptive, contextual, and structural information about an archival resource. Archival finding aids serve as guides to the collection, and they follow standards set forth by governing bodies on how to organize and present information in a way that makes the information not only standardized, but interoperable. Archival finding aids are often the only point of contact between a researcher and an archive prior to an in-person visit, and the challenge of writing a finding aid thus lies in formulating a document that is descriptive as possible, which highlights the contextual relationships between entities which may not be legible otherwise. The creation of an archival finding aid can perhaps be seen as the initial layer of activation in an archive. Though scholars may think, and not, without cause, of archives as having an inherent structure, archival processing always imbues some level of subjective interpretation on the part of the processing archivist. In this way, archivists are responsible for the initial level of activation in an archive through their inclusions, omissions, and contextual bridges built through the parameters of description. I'm now going to give some examples of Fluxus material in the Hanhardt archive in which archivist interventions promoted this initial level of activation. The Hanhardt archives are a rich repository of Fluxus material. John Hanhardt is a collector of Fluxus art objects accumulated through personal relationships with the artists, including a very close, decades-long relationship with Namjoon Paik and Shigeko Kubota, as well as close relationships with Ken Friedman, Jonas Mekas, Hans Breder, Yoko Ono, Charlotte Moorman, John Hendricks, and the Fluxus collector Gene Brown. Hanhardt also purchased Fluxus objects through his friend Barbara Moore, book dealer of contemporary art and Fluxus publications and ephemera, through her stores Bound and Unbound and its predecessor Backworks. The archive includes original Fluxus publications and multiples, performance ephemera, media, and documentation of Hanhardt's involvement in intermediate pedagogies, including at the University of Iowa and Arizona State University. While Hanhardt did collect original Fluxus material from the 1960s and early 1970s, the bulk of the Fluxus material in the Hanhardt archives dates from 1974 to 2001, presenting an early Fluxus historiography, an insight into how key figures perceived the legacy of their contributions in the years immediately following the movement's height, and how scholarship developed around Fluxus. The Fluxus material in the Hanhardt archives is activated by archival description that prioritizes relationships between subjects and events, reflecting personality, relationships, and robust collecting tendencies of Hanhardt himself. In many cases, the processing of the Fluxus material in the Hanhardt archives exemplifies the need for descriptive intervention when writing a finding aid, and I'm going to try to describe such examples today. So though archival best practices generally prioritize the concept of original order, of respect for the preservation of the original order of the material, that is to preserve the context in which the material was delivered to us. In the case of the Hanhardt archives, the items were, in many cases, including this example that I'm showing here, delivered to us in a flat organizational structure, meaning this document was loose among a myriad of other material, not organized by date and packed randomly without contextual neighbors. So it falls on the archivist to determine how to best create groupings that facilitate the discovery of this material. It is not feasible in the case of an archive this large to simply describe material on an item level. So, describe each piece of paper in the collection. Therefore, what standardized groupings can be applied to this type of document? In the case of this example, which is an undated document containing a call for research material related to Fluxus from the Henny Onstad Museum in Norway, several names are mentioned in the document, over here. There are robust artist files for several of these artists in the Hanhardt archives, so it does not make sense to include this document in one selected artist folder. The next logical conclusion would be to file this under the venue, Henny Onstad. However, we are not truly able to describe each individual item in this archive, and there is not a significant trove of other material related to this venue, which would mean that the item would be filed under venue H, a category which is necessary due to the sheer amount of material, but doesn't provide much contextual information to a researcher using the finding aid to access Fluxus material in the Hanhardt archives, right? So this level of decision-making here illustrates the myriad of interventions contributed by the archivist when processing an individual archival item. And the archive is comprised of hundreds and thousands of items. When viewed in this context, one may understand two things. A, why the processing of this collection has been ongoing for 11 years, and B, that decision-making by the archivist is in fact highly subjective based on the archivist's area and levels of expertise and deep familiarity with the collection, in activation of the collection prior to that of historians, researchers, and other accessors of the collection. These decisions, as archivist Anna McNally writes in her paper, All That Stuff, Organizing Records of Creative Processes, in the archivist cataloging process, do not allow for uncertainty or indecision. Archivist decisions made prior to researcher access influence both the ease of information access and the accessor's view of the relative importance of a particular item or grouping. I'd also like to speak about the general categorization of the Namjin Pike material in the archive. The Pike material is a focal point of the Hanhardt archives and dispersed throughout the collection under various series categorizations. Notably, there is a distinction or lack thereof between material generated organically, that is through the organization by Hanhardt of exhibitions by Pike, including the Whitney Museum exhibition in 1982 and the Guggenheim Museum exhibition, The Worlds of Namjin Pike, in 2000, which traveled to Bilbao and Korea in the years following. Additionally, there are records of dozens of other Namjin Pike exhibitions curated by Hanhardt globally. Other organic troves of Pike material include direct correspondence between Hanhardt and Namjin Pike and the artist studio, not relating to a specific exhibition. And then the inclusion of secondary Pike material starts to appear in examining ephemera, some of which was obtained directly from Pike, but much of which was obtained through Hanhardt's collecting, including notably original material purchased through Bound and Unbound, documenting Pike and Charlotte Moorman's activities and exhibitions prior to his relationship with Hanhardt in the early 1960s. Another trove of material is media, of which the collection has over 1,500 objects, ranging from film, VHS, and DVD, to more obscure media carryover formats such as video disc VHD. Further complicating the already intellectually and originally nuanced organization of the Pike material is the inclusion in the Hanhardt archives of material relating to the development of the Namjin Pike archive collection at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C., which was initiated in 2009. The Hanhardt archives hold a substantial amount of facsimiles of archival documents included in the Smithsonian archives. So the question arises in all these levels of provenance and remove to determine how to describe this material in a manner that succinctly illustrates its material history as well as subject matter. In many ways, this is a distillation of the ultimate paradox of archival description, that there is always a tension between the description of the item itself, its physical place, versus its intellectual classification. In talking about processing this archive, I am reminded of the task of untangling a large and unwieldy knot. There is no straightforward path forward, other than slowly and methodically making passes at untangling until the strands are apparent. At a certain point, though, we must make the determination that enough passes have been made and the strands are untangled enough to be legible to scholars. This is with the understanding that things can always be further untangled, and in these cases, I think it is very important to note the impact that our researchers have on archival description. Archivists make an initial activation of the material through descriptive language and decisions made, but finding aids are living documents and can always be updated with further contextual information and passes, often brought to us by archive users. An example of this is the use of original Namjoon Pike audiovisual material from the Hanhardt archive in a documentary film about Pike. Whereas we are not able to digitize all the media in the Hanhardt collection because of constraints of our institution's size, the additional input from researchers as to the context and importance of these archival materials has greatly improved the level of description I am able to assign to these objects. This is an act of activation, as is the use of archives for curatorial research resulting in publications and exhibitions. It is the primary goal of an archivist to describe a collection in a finding aid in a way that best serves their researchers and facilitates discovery using the tools developed through prolonged relationships with the material. And likewise, it is the role of the researcher to further activate archival description through the scholarly illustration of connections and context. Thank you very much.